SOS, girl overboard.
Nobody told me about any tests.
Don't worry, it's a psychological test. You're automatically exempt.
Oh, all right.
Excuse me. Excuse me. In this video, I'm going to talk about why the pilot episode of MTV's animated series Daria is so good. Daria is a personal comfort show of mine. I've probably seen the pilot about 50 times, most likely more, but I don't want to embarrass myself, so I'm just going to cap it out at 50. But when I'm really stressed or anxious, it just kind of helps calm me down. And so I just always wanted to make a video highlighting what I find so great about it, and so that's what I'm going to do now. So if you happened to watch MTV back in the 90s, or if you are an avid watcher of Beavis and Butthead in current day, then the pilot episode of Daria was probably not your first time seeing the character Daria. Daria was a main character in MTV's Beavis and Butthead, often dubbed Diarrhea by the eccentric pair, and the three attended Highland High School together before Daria moved to Lawndale to attend Lawndale High, which is where we begin in the pilot.
You know, your mother and I realize it's not easy moving to a whole new town. Well, especially for you, Daria, right?
Did we move?
Well, I feel like this show was so popular during its first few seasons because of the timing. The pilot aired on March 3rd, 1997, and the 90s was ruled by grunge and all things alternative, especially in white suburban neighborhoods. I would say Daria also reflected the attitude of many teenagers and young adults who would now be millennials at that time, which is a bit apathetic and plagued by realism. The theme song has a lot of metal guitar and heavy bass elements with pretty ambiguous lyrics.
This is my stuff, got to get off, I may go pop.
Excuse me. Excuse me. It sounds like a song that you would hear during commercial break while the show was airing or on the radio during that time. The animation style of Daria also has very thick outlines compared to Beavis and Butthead's thinner outlines, which makes sense because Daria's original character design was created about 5 years earlier than the airing of the pilot of her spin-off show. Daria is also a bit grainy, which I personally love. I think 90s animation is incredibly charming, and I love it when I'm watching and there's a small splotch on the screen or a slight skip and just general imperfections. I feel like it's pretty hard to find things like that these days with advanced technology and HD cameras and advanced animation stuff. I don't even know what they use, but you know what I mean. And so the show generally follows a earth tone palette. However, there are bright colors included, mostly from the more extroverted characters such as Daria's younger sister Quinn or the airheaded cheerleader and football player couple Kevin and Brittany. So the show is also just generally very relatable in my opinion. Like I mentioned, most of MTV's audience at the time was teenagers and young adults. That could probably still be said now, but definitely back then in the 90s. And many viewers could likely relate to the concept of going to a low-budget high school with the principal who prioritizes the sports teams over everything, and having unhinged teachers who are either way too aggressive or are completely clueless to how boring their classes are, or they don't care because they're not getting paid that well. And whenever I see the classrooms in Daria, I'm always reminded of that one video of the white boy with the really long, luscious hair who's snapping on his teacher about the flawed education system.
Hearing this freaking lady go off on kids because they don't freaking get this crap. If you would just get up and teach them instead of handing them a freaking packet, yo. There's kids in here who don't learn like that.
The writing is also one of my favorite aspects of this show. Many adult animated shows of the time adhered to scripts centered around sarcasm, irony, and quick wit that would typically go over the heads of much younger or much older audiences outside of the target demographic. I feel like Daria is a bit unique though, because most of the dialogue is coming from the perspective of a teenage girl. And I feel like many adult animations at the time had male protagonists or male ensembles, so it wasn't abnormal for them to have that kind of demeanor. But I feel like girls and women usually aren't allowed to be sarcastic and ironic and kind of have more of a standoffish demeanor. And that's something that Daria actually faces as a struggle throughout the entire series. So I really like how they already start to introduce that conflict of hers in the pilot.
Don't worry, I don't have low self-esteem. It's a mistake.
I'll say.
I have low esteem for everyone else.
What do you think of this one?
It stands proudly and proclaims, I am.
Really?
All. I guess I'd like my whole family to do something together.
Excellent.
Something that'll really make them suffer.
How's the old self-esteem coming, kiddo?
My self-esteem teacher says that being addressed all my life with childish epithets like kiddo is probably a key source of my problem.
Really?
No.
And to continue off that, majority of the interaction in this show is between female characters, with Daria, Jane, Quinn and Co., Helen, and Brittany sharing most of the screen time. And Jodie, she had a good amount of screen time in season 1, but I do think they kind of amped her up in season 2. But they all have male counterparts. So Jane and her brother Trent, Quinn and all of her suitors, Jamie, Jeffrey, and Joey, I believe, Helen and her husband Jake, and Brittany has Kevin. And so in most of their shared dialogue, I would say that the women are leading the conversation and the men are just kind of bouncing off their lines, which I personally love because it's usually the other way around. Now, for those who are like me and have probably watched Daria maybe one too many times, there are definitely some things that I've picked up on after just rewatching the pilot over and over and over and over and the rest of the show. And the first thing would be the voice acting. So in the pilot, as well as the first few episodes of the season, like really just episode 1 and 2, Brittany, who is the cheerleader that I mentioned earlier, has a much lower register compared to the later episodes where her tone is much more shrill and high-pitched. She also talks a bit slower, and she talks fairly slowly throughout the entire show, but it's definitely much more noticeable in the first episode or two.
Ah, Brittany. Can you guess which war we fought against the Mexicans over Manifest Destiny?
No?
Please try, Brittany.
The Viet Cong War?
So I personally like how much slower and softer her voice is in the first episode or so, but I will say her tone later represents her personality more, so I understand the decision making there.
Like, when you get a multiple choice question, you can usually eliminate 2 of the answers right off.
Excuse me, sir? Does that work with true-false?
So Jane Lane, who is Daria's quickly made best friend in the first episode, has a diction and pace of speaking that was much slower, and she also just had a very low register in the beginning of the first season. Her voice is always raspy throughout the entire show, but to me it stands out a lot more in the first episode or two, similar to Brittany. And to me, Jane seems like the least scripted character to start, and I think that's because most of her dialogue just kind of bounces off what people around her are saying, and I feel like later in the show it becomes a lot more calculated and deliberately scripted. So that's just a very small thing that's interesting to me, but I would say in general Jane's character and her tone is very consistent throughout the show.
I've said it before, I'll say it again. You have the coolest room.
It's got pros and cons. You can't hurt yourself in here, but you can't hurt anybody else in here either.
So I do think it's interesting how Sandy greeted Quinn very politely in the pilot. And I wonder if this was before they decided that Sandy and Quinn were going to have a rivalry / frenemy type situation. Because if so, I think it would have made more sense to have Sandy be way more standoffish towards Quinn, or to maybe give her a backhanded compliment to introduce that tension from the beginning. And I also think this is a very rare moment where we see a genuine smile on Sandy's face, because most of the time she's smirking, and it's typically after she's bruised Quinn's ego in some way. So there's definitely much more that I want to say about this show. I think I'm probably just going to make a playlist and probably do character studies and breakdowns of character possession and development over the entire show. I definitely want to do a video about how they pretty much tarnished Daria's entire character in the last 2 seasons, and why the first 3 seasons are, in my opinion, the best. The first one is untouched. I feel like season 2 is the best in terms of plot continuity and just it being interesting. And then the 3rd season was kind of already starting to fall off a bit, but it's somewhat redeemable. And I feel that way about Sex and the City too. I'm definitely going to be making videos about Sex and the City because these are both shows starting in the 90s. And I think the influence of the early 2000s kind of took away the personality of both shows at some point. So definitely keep an eye out for those. I'm going to be doing way more in-depth videos about Daria. Thank you to the Daria fan channel for these clips that I've been using. I really was struggling to find the episodes. And yeah, so I hope this was interesting. I will definitely be doing more videos like this in the future. And for now, I will wrap it up here. So thank you if you made it to this point in the video. And yeah.
Excuse me. Excuse me. I've got to be direct.